Hello, and welcome to the first episode in our 2026 summer series, Witness to War Crimes. My name is Sam Maguire, and I'm a production intern at Asymmetrical Haircuts. Together with my colleague Gigi Green, we'll be diving into the archives and republishing episodes to do with the theme Witnesses, looking at how journalists, filmmakers, and investigators bear witness to global atrocities, often when no one else will. In this episode, recorded in October 2022, we sat down with Almudena Bernabeu, the prosecutor at the People's Tribunal on the murder of journalists in, where else? The Hague. In September of that year, the tribunal delivered a judgment holding the governments of Syria, Sri Lanka, and Mexico responsible for failing to provide accountability for the killings of journalists in their countries. It's a conversation that sadly hasn't dated all too much. If anything, it's more relevant now than when we first recorded it. So stay tuned until the end, where we will update you on what's changed since then.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
All rise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
Last month, The Hague was again the seat of a tribunal, and this time it was to hear the final judgment of the People's Tribunal on the murder of journalists.
Yes, this feels really personal because we are both journalists.
Yeah, well, the kind of murders that they were investigating happened in places like Syria and Sri Lanka, may be a bit more dangerous than our general type of daily work. So we thought that we'd take a moment to actually chat to the prosecutor of that tribunal, Almudena Bernabeu. Hi, Almudena.
Hi, how are you?
We're very well, thank you. Almudena is the co-founder of the Guernica 37 group and joint head of the Guernica 37 chambers.
She's got a ton of expertise and has been an advocate for multiple landmark cases regarding international crimes in Chile, in El Salvador, Colombia, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Peru, Bangladesh, Iraq, Venezuela, Guatemala, the Gambia, and Mexico.
You may have actually seen her in the documentary Granito, How to Nail a Dictator. That was about Guatemala genocide against the Mayan people, getting the former Guatemalan dictator Efraín Ríos Montt for genocide.
And if you're an avid ICC follower, you might have seen that she's filed communications about the Saudi-led coalition attack on civilian population in Yemen, arguing that it constitutes war crimes and crimes against humanity.
And you may have seen her, Steph, actually at the Kosovo Specialist Chambers. What was she doing there?
She was counsel for the defense of Nassim Haradinaj, who was the vice president of Kosovo Liberation Army Veterans Association. And she was part of the legal team leading the defense of several suspects under the investigations for international crimes allegedly committed during the 1998-99 conflict in Kosovo.
Well, very potted biography, but we're actually going to focus on your role at the People's Tribunal. Let's start off with a basic understanding of what it is. I'm sure people ask you, Almudena, what is it that you're up to? What's your phrase that you use to describe what this thing is?
First of all, happy to be discussing all of this with you, because to be honest, I will introduce the topic by saying that there's very little overall knowledge of the strength and the scope of a tribunal of this kind. And I never want to be, take the credit, including for myself. When I was first called to participate at this tribunal in Guernica as an office, was invited. And then all my colleagues here, barristers, and they thought that my experience, prosecutorial experience, would be the best to suit the needs of the tribunal. So I had to really rush into what am I doing? What is this setting and what is expected from this setting? And I have to say that I am quite impressed. Perhaps you want to see that it's marginal in the context of the last 30 years of the advances of establishing both efforts such as the international tribunals and also permanent institutions, as we have now the ICC. But in my opinion, there's so much room for spaces or for initiatives like this one that I'm going to hopefully describe, because there's so much that still happens to humans, new phenomena, as this one it is, the persecution of journalists, something that could be so obvious, but really we have never seen it in this with this gravity or with this frequency or with these following these patterns that were discussed later. And so much of it sometimes is not attended by the ongoing institutions or ongoing international efforts, that I found that the People's Tribunal was a very serious effort to shed light over a problem that has become endemic, that has become transnational and across the borders, whether countries are democratic or pseudo-democratic or authoritarian. In many instances, the same treatment when they try to suffocate the truth or they try to suppress something coming out to light, whether it's corruption or whether it's malfeasance of any kind. And the People's Tribunal, for how, bear with me, sounds really naive, but for how new the subject matter is within the context of international human rights violations or international violations, and accountability for those kind of crimes seem like a very adequate venue. So the idea was behind this People's Tribunal, frankly, to just expose this violence, expose this targeted group, and kind of take it to the next step, but we're hoping naturally that this tribunal will achieve.
Okay, you've given a great kind of introduction to why it's so important, but you still haven't precised down for me what exactly it is. I mean, it's kind of a civil society initiative which fills a gap.
Exactly. It's rigorous. It's run by a treaty. So it was signed a treaty that, exactly right, and not exclusively civil society. Any person in the world could bring to the tribunal a particular concern, for lack of a better word, and the tribunal will decide. The institutional, or is loose in the sense that it's not a building in the middle of Rome, but it's a number of human beings that have been there, making sure that this is functioning, and they will consider whether the subject merits to be able to then put the mechanism of the backing, or the structure and the concept and the mandate of the tribunal to the service. And that's what it did. This particular tribunal for the murder of journalists is an initiative of 3 civil society groups, actually quite well reputed around international groups that have been working with journalists, vigilant of the rights of journalists and the safety of journalists. We have CPJ,
the Committee for the Protection of Journalists.
Exactly. And then Freedom Press, which is it's international, but based in The Hague. And Reporters Without Borders, the particular, the French branch, which is the foundational and the original. So they put together this initiative that was accepted and endorsed by the tribunal.
My concern here is because it's kind of a civil society initiated, and then, as you say, it does something quite rigorous, and we'll get into the detail of what it is. But isn't it because those civil society, those are essentially pressure groups? It doesn't actually mean that it's just a bit of propaganda.
I don't think so. And I think that precisely that they went through this route when they could have done, there are many other practices out there to put a particular issue on the table or to get governments to engage, to public policymakers. I actually think that they were thinking accountability. They were thinking about the commission, not in the frameworks of international criminal law that is so tighting and so strict, but they were thinking about accountability. We're talking about people that are dying, or they're being persecuted, or they're being shut down by governments, by, organized crime, you name it, or sometimes even worse, by the association of governments and organized crime. And we're talking about impunity in percentages that are really scary. So because they were thinking about accountability, that's where they wanted something beyond just a demonstration or a report or a press conference, if you know what I mean, with all the importance that those steps may take and how much they can get done. They wanted to put it with the wrapping, of a more formal, and to me, it's everything but propaganda. Perhaps that's why 3 very serious associations got together and thought about the structure of the tribunal and thought about meaningful, and I'm sure you're going to ask me about that as we speak about the composition, but really well reputed and proven with credentials, people that will do the panel of judges. They will have the knowledge, the depth, the experience, and frankly, the gravitas. There's some people in the panel of judges, they have very large experience. This sounds very pretentious because I'm going to talk about myself in third person, but I'm not I'm not just, like an academic. I'm pretty out there. In my position, I always joke with them because my brain goes into places that sometimes they wanted to refrain me from going, because I'm prosecutorially designed. And they would say, well, we're not going to go as far as that, Almudena, because this is not a tribunal 100%. I mean, this has to remain in this spectrum of having a component of civil society and symbol. And for me, I would have gone much farther. So they were more prudent than I was. But I think that having someone like me also proves the commitment of analyzing the subject, the issue from within. And actually, I'm persuaded that the result of these, it's not a statement of international criminal law, but it's going to be very aligned with trends and standards that touch, in my opinion, accountability for international crimes.
And if we look a little closer at your role, how did you approach your work? You were explaining and I guess prosecuting the individual murders of journalists in specific countries. So did you or kind of your office gather evidence, found witnesses, or are you summarizing what other people have found? How did you approach this task?
Perhaps two-folded answer. One, I approach it as I do every single other case or investigation. And I will say that from a place of a pretty obvious lack of knowledge, ignorance of the facts and the circumstances, it's a little generic, but the surround, they both from to me, it's very important in the criminal. And again, this is my mind and how I think. But what are the causes that put people in a particular vulnerable situation? So understanding that, then obviously the dangers that ended up in many instances, particularly in the cases that I had to attend and to study and to prepare for, and to know which are the result were the killings of the journalists, just that plain, and then. For me, it was a huge learning curve because as much as you think about crimes or state-inflicted violence and, that kind of things that has been my cup of tea, you realize how little you know about a particular new set of circumstances. And attacking women is different than attacking children, and attacking journalists is different than violence, against indigenous people, to just some of the experience that I have acquired over the years. So the learning curve. And then something very important, the second part of the question, is that there was a young, spectacularly hardworking team put together, legal team by the organizations. They put this initiative together. So it would be very unfair on my part to say, I did all the work. They have done a very important, a huge amount of work as to selecting the cases that was there. This is really what they wanted to do. They knew the cases that they wanted. And they had aligned crucial people that will testify as witnesses in different, to be honest, when I came is with the knife, the strategy knife, as I call them, everything was a little bit excessive, thinking from a trial perspective. And I wanted to be as clean and as succinct as a judge will have. A judge will have knocked me in the head if I brought 5 witnesses to talk about the same story, as important as the story can be. So what I brought was that kind of sense, hopefully after 25 years of doing this, of, with 3 witnesses, we want to engage our judges, engage our audience. What do you want to prove here? Because people were deaths for the most part. Particular attacks were public. So, it was not so much about informing about the happening, but to try to be very meticulous about who are we making, even though this trial, again, is not about a conviction or a putting someone in jail. You want it to be rigorous about the evidence, the precedents, potential patterns, elements of the crime, and eventually the result, which was the killing of these people, and who is responsible. It's at the end of the day, it's pretty linear when you do criminal law, but that's a little bit of the sense. It was great amount of work done by them, and I guess my contribution was to stream it to be part of a trial.
And what exactly were you trying to prove? Does journalists do a dangerous job in war zones? That's not the thing you're trying to prove. It was more to do with the actual pattern of impunity and what that means? What precisely?
I think three elements, and they all will go into patterns for sure, definitely. One is that exactly right. I mean, that all these deaths, all these attacks, wherever they happen and under the different circumstances, whether it's a conflict, whether it's a social revolt or some sort of dissenting or civil disobedience, whatever the context is, or in the context of Syria was purely Arab Spring, civil disobedience. Whatever the context, what you have is a pattern on how these people were targeted, how these people were surveyed, how progressively they became the enemy of a particular set of, whether it was leadership or intentions of that leadership, of political regime, or corrupted government officials. And then it is really fascinating to me, the progression of how they become from a true journalist, independent and autonomous, to be a potential target. And then from there on, the perpetrator, different instances of the perpetration, want to get rid of them. And that was, to me, very powerful to show it as almost identical as a pattern naturally is in three different countries with three different circumstances. Perhaps the second component was the impunity. It is that so many efforts, the last few years, there's been from the United Nations, special rapporteurs, coalitions of governments, the envoy by United Kingdom, led by what is called the panel, the high-level panel with all of these professionals, lawyers for the most part. And despite of all those efforts, the impunity for these crimes is almost 100%, if not 99%, which is not strange to me. It's not foreign to me, because I come from the generation of lawyers that we're here just to see if we can fight that impunity in this persistence. But it was shocking to me that with the disparity of the places where these attacks take place, from northern countries to southern countries, with that disparity, with the disparity of the work, the investigative and the reporting work of those journalists, and different even level of judicial, guarantees and judicial systems, and still is so persistent, the impunity. And perhaps the third part that needed a little bit of light to me is, and I think that this effort is about the perpetration. Who is behind? Something that one of the witnesses, Paul Conroy, said in a way that just chilled my back, is when he said, during the Syria conflict, and now it is the case in Ukraine, and it's going to be the case going forward, unfortunately, journalists became casualties, because obviously, people die in wars and conflicts, and they could die as well, to be targets, to be something that we needed to get rid, because whether it's through social media, through rigorous journalism, whatever, we are exposing things and they have realized somehow, people realized it was very easy to kill the journalist, to suppress the piece of information. That is unthinkable 40 years ago. And I think that this tribunal came to, perhaps sounds a little technical, but no, when you listen to the human story, it is really what has been happening. That is 35 years ago, 40 years ago, the journalist was not the target. It happened. It got killed, got in danger, and exposed itself, but it was never the problem to be, to cut off. And I think hopefully that informs the next 20 years.
And listeners, you can't see it, but we can. Almudena is moving our hands around a lot and also banging the table for emphasis. So maybe that's what you hear in the recording, just to let you know that we can't get rid of that, but he's really passionate about it. I wanted to ask what kind of details for the specific cases you needed to kind of prove that pattern, how somebody becomes from kind of a regular journalist in let's say the regime's eyes into somebody who's an enemy of the state or your rule that you need to get rid of. Was there any specific things that you were looking for to prove that pattern?
It's just also the time in history that we're living, which is so interesting. The Arab Spring provided for so many of these examples, to your question. You have a youth generally speaking, at the university, for instance, which has been the entire history from the 1960s. It's always been the curious group, the ones that caused trouble, the ones that provoked change, whether it was women's rights or gay rights, or in Spain, getting rid of the dictator. Doesn't matter. So you have from that particular seat in the Arab Spring, you then, because of social media, because of communication, in a way being more democratized than ever. Here we have podcasts, you guys are doing this great. So all these beautiful sources of getting informed and getting engaged, then made really easy to also communicate at large certain flaws or certain wrongdoings or certain irregularities. And so what we were looking as a pattern, to answer your question as a trend, was that, what is to communicate and what were the dangers the people were undertaking. And then suddenly you realize that both the consecrated journalist from the New York Times and the young person attending university outside of Damascus at some point were communicating the same thing or were exposing the same thing. And they became both the same target with the difference that it's much easier to kill the young student from Damascus than the New York Times journalist. That was very upsetting to the perpetrators or the governments. And then eventually they went after the New York Times journalist as well, because what they couldn't really, the madness is that they couldn't control the information getting out. And how do you do that? Well, let's kill, it always does kind of, let's kill the New York Times journalist, because, and then maybe, as it happened forever, and at least in my investigations, some killings are also lectures or lessons to suppress other type of conduct. So what we're looking is into that, the information provided for the pattern, the particular happening that was denounced, that was exposed, provided for the pattern. And then also, which is a different conversation, but it is relevant in this context, the misinformation that then happened right after. What kind of information would then be produced by, whether it is the Philippines government or the Syrian regime under Bashar al-Assad, to counter attack the information they had leaked or they had been exposed. So that is fascinating, but that's the information that we were thinking. I think the information and the profiles of the people, and eventually the way they were treated with that information, how much put them in danger, was one of the key patterns, for instance.
You mentioned already a very large number of initiatives that have been taken in this area. I mean, it's become a key area of concern how press has been targeted and how to protect the freedom of speech. But it's still very curious to me, the idea of choosing this model as a way of highlighting the issue, running a people's tribunal. And I'm wondering whether the three organisations, Free Press Unlimited, Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters by Borders, did they know what they were doing when they said we're really going to have this kind of a process? I mean, did they choose it in order to expose the kind of evidence that you're talking about?
I hope I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody, and I guess this is a question to present them with. I will not say in the despair that my victims and clients over the years felt about not having a particular recourse or a particular venue where to bring their complaints, but it was a little bit of that sentiment. I think that if I can speak, again, this is probably very pretentious on my part, but if I can speak from the colleagues of these organizations, their feeling is, how can we make noise and be listened? Because a lot of the established and well-established places are not looking at this issue with the scope and the depth and the gravity that this issue deserves. In my opinion, I was persuaded within 24 hours, and I'm not easy to persuade on these matters. I am of the school of I just hate, if you allow me here a little caveat, the alarmism amongst the colleagues in the international criminal arena, where everything is a crime against humanity, everything is a genocide, is like, for crying out loud. I mean, these crimes took us forever, to put in a criminal code, to understand it, to decode it, to use it. So we have to be prudent. So these kind of like, oh my God. Well, no, when you go there and you start investigating, you realize that, well, Yes, it was violence, could be random, could be civilians, but not necessarily amounts at times to, So I actually think that it comes a little bit from that, from quite the opposite, from them knocking at doors and saying, what you have here is massive. It's transnational. It's happening for the same reasons. Mexico is particularly bleeding in my heart, because in Mexico it's just as grotesque and as gross as every other violence, whether it would have been women. But how did you bring this to the attention of people? And I think that was what was behind this effort, honestly.
And you have wide experience of prosecuting and litigating international crimes. What parallels do you see? Because the indictment uses, of course, the words widespread and systematic, which suggests that the murder of journalists should be seen as a crime against humanity.
The patterns that I see, many, in the sense of the traditional criminal investigation that ends up in a criminal trial and ideally in a conviction, you are facing very much, think about how you put it together. What you have is, just to name some, states and perpetrators that are not willing to collaborate whatsoever. Not only they're not going to tell you I did or I didn't do it, is that they also are engaging in denial, in putting, as much sand and whatever they can to tell you are a liar, you're delusional. So you encounter the same resistance that usually is targeting manipulation, public opinion, that kind. So you have the same obstacle. Perhaps the other part that to me is a parallel that is very important is, what kind of evidence do you have? Precisely because you're going against the states or against very powerful perpetrators, you don't find a document. You don't find a letter. They're going to destroy documents. They're going to put them into hiding. If it's a government, usually archives, they are not accessible. So, and then you rely only on witness testimony, not exclusively, but mostly on witness testimony. And that also, it is something to very much as a practitioner to take into consideration. When you need to prove almost your entire case through witnesses, it's very strong, but it's delicate. You have to be very mindful, and that's another. And I agree with you with your statement that this is a spread. This is systematic, and the systematicity, is done the same way. As I was telling at the beginning, you can draw even parallels on the timing. When a journalist starts exposing a particular event or a particular corruption scheme, and then they let them work, they let them publish, but then they start threatening their outlet, they incur in some legal actions to try to close the outlet. So that systematic approach to the repression is not just arriving and killing them. It's a little bit of a process that you can see in different countries. And perhaps that's what I got excited. So I'm sorry to say excited, but I got excited because I see a lot of potential in the proper venue to bring criminal charges against perpetrators and to have from this effort on, to have real trials and real investigations to begin with on the murder of journalists.
And in the People's Tribunal, you don't have the actual accused in the dock. You don't have a representative of a government. I was talking to a senior lawyer recently about trials in absentia, and they were suggesting that trials in absentia are really not really worthwhile doing, because at the end of the day, you've really just got to redo them if you do get hold of the person. So really, what's the point? But on the other hand, the People's Tribunal, even though you don't have the person in the dock, doesn't have that purpose. The purpose is to show the extent of your wares, to show how much evidence you have, to really show what the case would be. So I'm wondering, what's your opinion?
Right, I think both things. Because on the one hand, and it's important for people to know, the ones at stake in this People's Tribunal is usually states, is not individual. So this is not an individual liability effort. So it will be against a particular country of a particular state. And all three states that they were chosen, to expose the violence against journalists, Sri Lanka, Syria, and Mexico, all of them, and look at it. I mean, you have Sri Lanka with a pseudo-stable government. Actually, in the middle of the tribunal, the whole Rajapaksa regime exploded. But I mean, at least when the tribunal was established, the Rajapaksas were ruling and things were a little bit more stable. And then Mexico, you have López Obrador, and it is and then Syria, which is, the chaos that is trying to legitimize himself, post repression with Bashar. But all of them were given the opportunity to be par with their own lawyers or with their own representatives of any kind. They don't have to be lawyers, could be a foreign affairs, could be a special ambassador or attaché. And all of them decided, Mexico doubted, at some point thought about maybe sending a representation, but all of them decided not to defend. And so that is on the one hand. And so the opportunity was provided and they rejected it. But on the other hand, I disagree with that colleague that said that the in absentia prosecution is not needed. First of all, many countries have it. Argentina has it. Italy has it. And I have to say that even if you are a true believer, as I am, of due process, in absentia provides precisely in these kind of cases that to me have a social dimension and they are affecting all of us, whether you accept it or not. Because, a massacre in a next to my hometown town, that affects everyone. You can deny it, you can look in a different direction, but eventually that's going to affect who you are and how you live in a particular country and who rules you. I think the killing journalists is a problem of social dimension. And in that kind of trials, I think the process is much more important than the result, in the sense that what you're trying is to educate your people, to inform in many instances of what happened, who did it, why was it done, to expose sometimes a regime, sometimes an individual, for the most part, political contexts. They are in the past or they are gone. And I actually think there's a huge amount of value of those trials. And if the perpetrator wants to come or is arrested and that needs to be reinstated, it's never a waste of time. The evidence is there, is being processed, is being admitted under the rules. I actually think there's a lot of value in those kind of efforts.
If you look at the People's Tribunal specifically, do you know, are those findings ever accepted in quote unquote real courts? What is the legal value of the determination you make? I've never really seen it be cited in real cases. Sometimes it feels like it, but I'm not at all the international law cases all the time.
Well, I think that there's a lot of what was shared or testified upon or introduced as evidence at the People's Tribunal that could be absolutely useful in the context. If tomorrow, which is not going to happen because it doesn't work that way, I don't want to confuse anybody, but if tomorrow the ICC created a special chambers that says we're going to investigate and try killing of journalists because we believe it's a phenomenon that requires that kind of attention, much of the work that has done here could be extrapolated, could be the beginning. Now, the problem is that is not being admitted or scrutinized, with the level or the threshold that a tribunal will do, with the threshold of the standard of proof, with, it needs to be filtered, for lack of a better word, through a different set of rules that it will be a criminal court. But in terms of substantially, absolutely. What is there proves criminal conduct, proves aggravating circumstances, use of power, state-inflicted violence. I mean, there's a lot of criminal elements in the work done by the tribunal.
So what's your hope in the end, Almudena, for what you achieve with this? I mean, I'm wondering whether it might be a better parallel with truth commissions. I know you've served on those as well, that you kind of set in stone, sort of as the result of this court, a certain set of understood facts and outcomes. And is that what the outcome of this tribunal should be?
This falls more into personal answers, so I'm going to frame it. I mean, this is a personal opinion, very much a professional opinion. When you look back, 35, 40 years, and I've said this publicly before, every single truth commission or every single collective effort of this kind, designed wrongly, rightly, clumsily, whatever way, designed to expose a particular phenomenon, talk about it as clearly as possible about it. It have this kind of vocation. All of them, if you look at it, I dare anybody to find one that did not ended up in very contundent accountability efforts. I'm not saying successful, because success is completely different, measure in my work, and I don't speak in that way. But definitely, if you look at Guatemala, Argentina, Chile, I'm talking about where the original truth commissions in the context of authoritarian regimes and conflict and post-conflict, kind of the beginning of the transitional justice processes as we know them today. But let's talk about Tunisia. Let's talk about, obviously, Germany with the tribunal. I mean, every single effort of accountability that was serious and that is, I actually think, informs our work in our field started this way. So I actually think they could very much serve, not isolated, not alone, but I think to create a momentum of where, okay, now we talked about these in 3 countries at the same time. Look at what we're talking. I mean, look at and then let's see what it goes next. And I actually think people are going to pay attention. And at the very is this document, is this tangible result from this very, very massive effort done by these three groups that actually you'll see how it will carry something. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. We always end our podcast with more personal questions. And so we have 3 what we call asymmetrical haircuts questions that we always ask all our guests. And the first one is a very job interview one, apparently, which is, what didn't we ask you, but we should have?
I was afraid that you will ask me, do you think that this is going to be a successful? And you didn't. So I actually did the opposite. You have not asked me because no, I think that the most important aspects of the challenges that this work, are there.
Oh, it's always good to know that we're well-rounded.
Our second question is, do you have a favorite court case? Something maybe back from earlier in your career, something you have an anecdote about that you'd like to share with us? I mean, it can be favorite for a bad reason as well as for a good reason.
Well, I guess one of my favorites, I have to be the anecdote favor in a positive note. It's the one that I shared, and then I found a husband because I married the man that I tried a case with. We were working together. We were in scandal at the time because we got involved. They don't do that. You don't do that. So, but I did, and now he's my husband. We've been together for 18 years. So this is how long ago. And 1 son. So I guess it wasn't that bad. I guess my case, one of the cases that you guys mentioned, the Guatemala genocide case. And not only, obviously, it was a very personal moment for me. It was a lot of growth as a lawyer and as a woman and expose myself. It's also the first time, which I tell this anecdote, the first time I was threatened actively, all these things that you imagine someday will happen. All of them happened to me. But there is also the case that taught me more about, what this work is about, because the cases you may remember ended up going back to Guatemala, and the trial actually happened in Guatemala by Guatemalan judges. They're all really good friends. And, we were just saying this in theory. For years, you will have these kind of discourses that the best thing that can happen is that someday justice is done in the country where the abuses took place. All of us, they care about this, have heard this statement. And at some point, you want to be honest, you go to bed sometimes thinking, am I ever going to see that? It's like, am I just saying this because it's the right thing to say, or are we frankly trying to impact, this home countries? So Guatemala was against all odds, a much precarious tribunals and professionals less acquitted to this. And when we saw that happening in 2013 and delivering that verdict of genocide with a room full of indigenous people wearing their, so proud. I mean, I still get goosebumps. I mean, that case was one of the most difficult things I've ever done, but one that has to make you very proud.
And our final asymmetrical haircuts question is there anything that you are reading, watching, listening to at the moment that you can recommend? You can be absolutely very legal. You can also tell us what you're listening to when you want to get away from all the legal stuff. We're interested in both.
Well, three quick answers. What I listen is always jazz or the Smiths, because I got stuck in the 1980s, the Smiths, and they still allow me to edit writing pleadings, the Smiths, reading documents, jazz, usually Ella Fitzgerald. What I would recommend, a spectacular TV show on Prime called The Story of a Kidnapping. And it is based on a novel by Gabriel García Márquez on actually a particular and very interesting time in Colombian history when Pablo Escobar, and this goes to the subject matter, and I will leave it at that. I actually was telling the other day, the guys at the People's Tribunal, Gabriel García Márquez, who's Nobel Prize, obviously everybody knows who he is, wrote a book about 2 weeks of Colombia agonizing because a number of very prominent journalists had been kidnapped. Not all of them survived. I don't want to spoil the TV shows. It's like 13 episodes. But it is when Pablo Escobar, the narco trafficker, decided that to put pressure on a couple of legislature and political decisions could happen by kidnapping journalists. And it's an interesting twist of who is the journalist in our societies and why are we kidnapping journalists to put pressure on the executive and on the legislative to not pass a particular provision in their constitution. All of these are true facts. I think that is from the show is from the perspective of the victims, of the families, of those kidnapped, and you can never put it down. I watch it all like that.
You binge watched it. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. That sounds like a great recommendation. I have to get Amazon Prime now.
Thank you so much for giving us some time, Almudena. And I'm absolutely sure we will come across you again and again in many contexts in the future. So thank you for talking to us in this context.
It was an honor. Thank you very much.
Please come talk to us again. And if you're in The Hague, come visit us so we can buy you a coffee and ask you about other stuff.
Promise, I will.
Interrupting our regular programming just to say, please come and support us on Patreon and get our newsletter. For the price of just a cup of coffee, you can hear Janet and me talk even more about war crimes and books that we like to read and music that we like to read and what we are doing. Come and follow us and support the show. Thank you.
Hi, Sam here again, bringing you a quick update on this episode. As you heard, the People's Tribunal on the murder of journalists delivered its judgment on 3 cases involving murdered journalists, concluding that Mexico, Sri Lanka, and Syria were responsible for human rights violations linked to the failure to properly investigate the killings, provide reparations to victims, and address a so-called wider culture of impunity. Since we spoke to Almudena back in 2022, it felt important to take a look at where things stand for journalists today. And unfortunately, the situation has only become more urgent. Reporters Without Borders' most recent annual roundup found that 67 journalists were killed because of their work between 2024 and 2025, making it the deadliest year for the profession since they began recording. A large proportion of those deaths happened in Gaza, where local journalists have often been the only source of information from inside the territory, despite working under incredibly dangerous conditions with attacks on media infrastructure and almost no safe space to report. Gaza is not the only place where journalists are facing extraordinary risks. In Sudan, since the outbreak of the war, reporters have been threatened, detained, displaced, and forced into exile, while those who remain continue working despite shortages of equipment, electricity, and connectivity. And in Ukraine, journalists covering the full-scale invasion are still reporting close to the front lines, facing bombardment, digital attacks, disinformation campaigns, and the psychological impact of documenting war. Stay tuned for the next 2 episodes, by the way, where we'll look at Gaza and Ukraine in more detail. Some of the countries discussed in the tribunal remain at the center of these conversations today. Mexico, for example, remains one of the world's most dangerous countries for journalists, with reporters continuing to face threats and violence while investigating issues such as corruption and organized crime. But there have also been important steps forward. Since 2019, the A Safer World for the Truth initiative, which supported the tribunal, has investigated 17 unresolved murders of journalists and contributed to new investigations, legal action and advocacy efforts in countries including the Philippines, Pakistan, Brazil, Kenya, and Greece. As Almudena says in this episode, accountability is not only about what happens after a journalist is killed, but also about challenging the systems that allow that killing and making sure that these crimes are not forgotten. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week with another episode from our summer series, Witness to War Crimes.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by Autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.